and thank you for attendees. This session is sponsored by the Union for Radical Political Economics, and we're very pleased to have 4 papers with a variety of approaches. First, Jacob ASSA will talk about the evolutionary theory of capabilities and sustainability. I will talk about the Anthropocene and its implications. Robin Hanel and Mitchell Stefanchik, he will repeat his last name helpfully for us. Computer simulation experiments of participatory annual planning. And Yan Zhao and Bangxi Li will be talking about Marushima's optimum values, a more Penrose pseudo-inverse approach. So each presenter will take 20 minutes, and we will wait till the end for Q&A. But if you have questions during the session, you're welcome to use the Q&A button. And we will watch these questions as they come in and then address them after the 4 presentations. So Jacob, why don't you proceed?
Thank you, Anne. I will share my screen.
All right, it should be okay now.
See. Can everyone see it?
Yes.
Okay, good. Let me see if I can actually move the slides. Good. Before I start, just a couple of disclaimers, one legal, one methodological. These are my views and not those of the UN. Same goes for the paper. And I'm using some mathematics, but it's meant to stimulate thinking about balance of power among economic and political institutions rather than solve for equilibria. Maybe in the future I will develop it further, but for now, the mathematics is just suggestive. So just to give you a bit of context, Anne mentioned the Anthropocene, and that was actually the theme of our 2020 Human Development Report at UNDP. There's no consensus yet, but many scientists believe that a new geological area has begun, where human beings are the main driving force of change at the planetary level. And this involves several severe phenomena: climate change, loss of biodiversity, increasing inequalities, climate refugees, and even some suggest COVID-19, which has its origins in zoonotic diseases. Many of these issues can be related to humanity's narrow focus on economic growth. And there have been a couple, more than a couple, but at least a couple of paradigms recently that have tried to challenge this focus on growth. One of them, which we champion in UNDP, goes back to Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. It's called the capabilities approach, and it focuses on growing people's freedoms rather than income. And the other one is a sustainable development approach, which in some cases accepts economic growth, but tries to change how it's done to make it greener. But if you follow the efforts of countries on the Paris commitments, you know that not enough has been done, and we are at a very dangerous point. So this paper proposes a new approach, a longer time horizon, looking at the whole of human evolution, and a broader perspective beyond markets and states to look at institutional balance. So first, human evolution and development. If you think about nature generally, a species adapts to its conditions, adapts and to environment in order to survive. And most species, except humans, are not as powerful as nature. So I'm using this term epsilon to denote that species evolve and nature evolves, but species can never overtake nature. Also within species, an individual specimen is inferior to the survival of the species itself. And Alfred Tennyson expressed that in a poem: "So careful of the type, she seems so careless of the single life." That was quoted by Amartya Sen. So in this sense, evolution implies that the species is more important than individuals. And if you combine the two, you have this inequality where nature is superior to any species and any species superior to any individual specimen within that species. Now, we as humans have broken this evolutionary trap. And here I rely on an idea from Yuval Harari, the book Sapiens in 2014. And he claims that what allowed us to do that is the ability to imagine and communicate abstract ideas like God, the market, state, mathematics, writing, which other species do not have that. And that's an ability we have within us, so it's endosomatic. But a 1945 paper by Lotka on evolutionary biology talks about this capability allowing us to have two exosomatic capabilities, that is social or outside of our body. One of them is organizing ourselves in groups of more than 150 people, which can be thought of as political power, relating to how individuals relate to their society. And the other one is economic power that comes from production, advanced tools, technology, which affects how we relate to nature. So one could say that humans have matched nature and we've become equal to it because we've achieved a certain assured level of survival. But still, up to the middle of the second millennium, one could say that individuals were still inferior to the human species overall, but humanity could be equal to nature. The Renaissance and the scientific revolution, the humanistic turn gave people different ideas, and they started to think they are more important than societies. And this interesting paper by Wolfgang Lutz in 2009 shows how the Reformation had practical policy implications where individuals were being educated, not just the elite. So here I define development as the process of bringing up individuals to the social frontier, making them equal to the human species. Now, the difference between evolutionary change and developmental change is that the evolutionary change occurs at the level of the species over the long run, while developmental changes occur at the levels of individuals over the short term, like a lifetime. So you could also think of development as trying to equalize capabilities of people up to the human frontier, whereas evolution pushes up the frontier vis-a-vis nature. So here we have the equality. Individuals equal our species, and our species is equal to nature. But the problem is we went too far, and I will argue that that is the source of both social and environmental problems. People already thought themselves superior to nature in the 16th century, but we simply did not have the technology. But the Industrial Revolution gave us the tools to do that. So for the first time, if you use the notation of this paper, the economic institutions, were as powerful or more powerful than political. And this had enormous consequences. Madison documents very famously the increase in GDP per capita growth. But it also meant that there were some social and environmental dislocations. I'll skip over this slide. Naomi Klein, in her interesting book, said that coal gave people dominance not just over nature, but over other people, because the new industries, the new technologies were owned by a minority, how we usually call it capital. And there has been an enormous rise in inequality, both between countries and within countries. So one could write the social imbalance as the individual, the wealthy individual, the corporation becoming more important than human society this way, while at the same time, our relationship with nature has deteriorated because now we have so much technology and we use it so irresponsibly that we lead to mass extinction, climate change, and so forth, which can be written as follows. Human species is more powerful than nature. So together we get the twin imbalances of the Anthropocene. The individual is bigger than the species or more powerful, and that leads to social inequalities, and humans are more powerful than nature. And there's no shortage of irony because these two capabilities, production and organization, gave us the means to escape the evolutionary trap. But at the same time, they might doom us either by war or by climate destruction. So this is where we stand. There have been some responses to that over the course of history. You can cite the French Revolution, which aspired for liberty, equality, and fraternity. The American Revolution is often thought of in patriotic terms as fighting against the British king, but it was also a class struggle against a multinational organization. The Russian Revolution, although the Russian Revolution specifically did not lead to democracy, but to dictatorship, as did reactions. And if you notice the title, The Polity Strikes Back. So society wants to defend itself against the economic sphere, as Polanyi would say. And that sometimes went too far, such as in Italy and Germany. So as I mentioned, Polanyi said societies want to defend themselves against the encroachment of the market, but sometimes they went too far. So instead of the economic sphere dominating the polity, totalitarian system dominate the economic system. And in that case, society also crushes the will of the individual. And we've seen a bit of that in the return of populist and xenophobic parties in many countries, developed, what's going on right now in the United States. And some have argued that this is a reaction to austerity, globalization, and other economic processes. There have been some more democratic reactions to this imbalance. The human development approach focuses on enhancing human freedoms. It goes back to Sen, that said the important thing is not to have commodities, but to be able to live the life you choose. But one problem I have with this approach is that it's expressed at the individual level, and there's no concept of the public good in terms of humanity, which is why this approach has not been able to be helpful in terms of sustainability. And if you use the notation from above, you can say that development from the point of view of human development aspires to equate the individual to the social frontier, but at the same time accepts humanity's superiority against nature, or saying development is more important than evolution in this view. On the other extreme, there's the sustainability movement going back to the 60s and 70s, trying to protect nature from the most harmful effects of the economy. So in many cases, this paradigm accepts economic growth as the goal, but wants to find a more friendly way to achieve it. Although in many cases, these involve private corporations and market mechanisms. So I call this counter-social evolution because in a sense, it preserves nature, but does not necessarily protect people. And it puts evolution, as I define, over development, as I define. So what is really missing? Both these approaches, sustainable development, human development, broaden the scope beyond economic growth. But each one deals with only one part of the disequilibrium or the imbalance. And what they're really missing is society, because people do not interact with nature directly, although they can, but society is really the missing link. So what I took, there's some background noise. Is that something we could stop? Let me see if I can stop it. Okay. So how can we bring together these two things? And one idea is to use the idea of a complex system, which has been prominent in natural sciences, but not so much in economics. Complex systems usually apply agent-based models, which I have done in other research. And these have four parts normally: individual agents, properties of the system, interaction of agents, and interaction of agents with the system. So to put together what I've described so far, you can think of human development as trying to improve agent functionings or capabilities such as health and education, whereas the sustainability movement trying to improve the Earth system functioning. But they're missing these two dotted lines. So in a way, what's missing, there are three things that are missing here. The line A is what leads from individuals and their capabilities to society based on their interactions, and that means institutions. The other link that's missing is the line B, because in a sense, only social and political interventions can really overcome things like climate change, not individuals. So I labeled these two triangles here a socially unstable process of sustainability, which does not concern itself with people. And on the other hand, human development, which does not concern itself with the environment, is environmentally unstable. One example was the Yellow Vest, Les Gilets Jaunes in France. They tried to pass a carbon tax without taking into account its regressive effect. There were protests in the streets, people were angry, and it didn't happen. So that's an example of sustainable development not taking into account human development. At the same time, we can have all the health and education we want, but if we destroy the planet, we will not get anywhere. So in a way, what we want is to equate human evolution with human development, or in this notation, make humans equal to the species level of accomplishments and capabilities while making sure that humanity is not more powerful than nature. Now, the policy implications are many, but I picked two sectors to talk about: energy and finance. Because one could argue that private ownership of finance exacerbates social imbalances, blocking human evolution, and private ownership of energy production are blocking environmental progress. Financialization has been linked to rising inequalities, poverty, unemployment, lower growth. And one of the problems with finance is that it's far more mobile and less tangible than industrial capital, and therefore harder to regulate. And the power of finance comes from its ability to create money. That has been disputed in the past, but now even the Bank of England and the Bundesbank acknowledge that banks create money. So, and most of the credit created today, up to 80%, is for speculative purposes, which can hurt even the economy, not just people. So is the alternative to nationalize the bank? Well, perhaps no, because state banks in many countries perform worse than private banks, even in China, based on this research. But there's a third approach, which is practiced, for example, in Germany, which is a bottom-up, non-for-profit, private, municipal or local approach. Banks owned by their members, municipalities and so forth, lower fees, recycling savings into the economy, favoring local firms, more sustainable practices, more competition, lower inequality, and less money in politics, which can help us reverse the imbalance of P equals E, or not equally. The same goes for energy. Many efforts towards sustainability involve market-based solutions, such as trade and cap, carbon taxes, and so forth, private-public partnerships. But in many cases, these are really skewed in reality towards the private. And another approach could be, instead of state versus private, to have energy democracy, municipalities and local communities owning their utility firms. That would accelerate transitions to clean energy, increase accountability to citizens. And one example is in Barcelona, which announced that its power supply will be controlled by the municipality by 2016. There are rural electric cooperatives, which were founded by the New Deal. And again, Germany pioneered an approach where citizens took over energy production firms and distribution, and they became cooperatives. And on some days, Germany consumes 100% of its energy from renewables. Now, I mentioned Germany. I'm not German, but perhaps it's not a coincidence that Germany is leading in those two areas, because the social imbalance, individuals more powerful than societies, often blocks collective efforts against climate change. And we can see that in the neoliberal model. And perhaps by coincidence or learning lessons learned, Germany learned from its experience with fascism and communism and social democracy and found the sweet spot in between. Now, I only have 3 minutes and 50 seconds left, so I will go to my final 2 slides. I'm going quite quickly, but there's more details in the paper. Initially, we were looking for a way to measure this. The UNDP went with a different index, Planetary Adjusted Human Development Index. In this paper, I present my own personal idea, which is a bit more radical, and that's why I'm here. And it focuses more on the balance of power. So the Human Development Index, the World Happiness Index, and many, many other greener indices still focus on endosomatic capabilities internal to individuals. But if we want to measure the balance of power between economic institutions, political institutions that I mentioned before, we have to look at the exosomatic capabilities, production and organization. We also have to look at the relative balance between the two, and the measure should not prefer one over the other. So if you want to have a measure looking at perfect balance, the measure should penalize or discount a neoliberal regime just as much as it discounts a totalitarian regime. And one candidate for this measure could be from the VDEM database, Social Class Equality in Relation for Civil Liberty. It looks at how far civil liberties such as access to justice, property, freedom from forced labor, and freedom of labor extend across the socioeconomic spectrum. And if you look at this graph, it's very interesting. The top perhaps is not surprising. Sweden is many people's favorite country, but you also have Estonia, Costa Rica, and a very poor country like Botswana. The bottom part is perhaps more illuminating because you have totalitarian countries like North Korea, countries that I would say are mixed, Russia and China, mixing some totalitarian and some capitalist regimes, and the United States. Because in each case, in different directions, the economic power exceeds the political, or the political exceeds the economic, whereas the countries performing the best have a better balance according to this indicator. And there could be many other indicators, but the point is that in order to address the major challenges of today, climate change, inequality, political disruptions, I propose in this paper that we need more balanced institutional structure And that means to bring back the economic at the same level of the political. Thank you very much.
Anne, you're muted.
I finished. Thank you.
Thank you very much for excellent presentation within the time limit. So please note that there's a question for you already in the Q&A. But again, we will get to the questions and discussion after all of the papers are presented. So I'm listed second in the program, so I think I will go ahead and go second. So we have some similar concerns, but a somewhat different approach. So again, all the better for discussion. So I've mentioned the Anthropocene in the title in the program, but I want to get a little bit more specific with this idea that money serves as blinders. Money is an abstract representation of the nation state. And so as a result, we humans have an effect on the environment, which is not apparent to most of us. And how could that be? So here's my question. So in the age of the Anthropocene, which I'm going to accept, although it's not fully approved by the geologic scientists, yet many of us as individuals are unaware on a daily basis that we are a force on the planet. And one hypothesis I'd like to explore in this presentation is the role of money as blinders. So while we are focused on daily exigencies of earning a living, are we unaware of our own activities which jeopardize the ecological functions on which our lives rely? And so to help explore this question, I'm looking at a historical case study of the financial revolution in England. And the ultimate goal here is to see beyond money, to understand the process of transition that might get us post-capitalist future to a sustainable economy. So I'd like to just review some of the basics of the structure of the liberal state. I propose that money changes with the emergence of the liberal state, rather than simply the instrument of trade by merchant nations. Money became the sinews of power and helped the capacity of war in the competition among European states. The so-called financial revolution can be traced to the late 17th, early 18th century in England, building on the experience of the Italian city-states and the Dutch Republic. The Bank of England was modeled on the Bank of Amsterdam, which is modeled on the Gyro Banks of Venice. And then the Bank of the United States was modeled on the Bank of England. And so the Glorious Revolution, widely known and also celebrated, was a way of reorganizing the organs and functions of the state. So taxation became the key relationship between the constituencies and with representation in Parliament. So briefly, the structure of the liberal state is public and private. Public is the formal state apparatus. The private is the two private institutions, the household and the firm. And the public sphere, and here I'm drawing on Habermas, was constituted by critical public debate and expressed in voluntary associations. And so here is a diagram that's drawn from Habermas' book, Transformation of the Public Sphere. So in the private, we have the firm and the household, the public sphere, moderated by the free press and the informed electorate, I wish, and the state, which is the elected public officials and the bureaucracy. And so the liberal state became self-sufficient in finance rather than going to the haute finance private banks like Rothschild and Warburg and Barings. And it was a modified form of social contract based on taxation. And so the Glorious Revolution established the king's general capacity to tax, conditional on approval and oversight by the parliament. So the operation of public finance was managed by two institutions, the Treasury and the Central Bank, and the strength of the currency was the constitutional responsibility of the state. So here's a kind of a detailed slide I'd like to talk through, highlighting some of the relationships that are usually hidden when we talk about money. So this glorious revolution brought in William from the Dutch Republic, and the Whigs who helped bring him in helped form the Bank of England, and the South Sea Corporation was founded in 1711, another merchant monopoly corporation, and they were given the Asiento trade in 1714, that is the monopoly on the Negro slave trade, which was given to enhance its stock price. And after the South Sea bubble and the Mississippi bubble, the consolidation of the merchant monopoly corporations was the backstop for public debt. And so this, I have some diagrams I'll show you as we go. The financial revolution in England was accomplished by repurposing existing corporate institutions. The Three Sisters, the Bank of England, South Sea Company, and the English East India Company with a public debt private equity swap. So the liberal state acquired the finance function along with the defense function, enabled by the monopoly corporations to consolidate public debt. And the first British consul, the perpetual bond, was issued in 1723 to support now what we think of as the perpetual state. So the wealth holders become a partnership with the liberal state as bondholders receiving interest in return for protection of property and the police and military functions. So I'm wondering, here's my question, did the share prices of the South Sea Company go up and down and people just care about the movement of the share prices without really revealing their human cargo? Did people know about, did they care that the slave trade was the basis of these assured corporate stocks? Okay, so the triangular trade is well known. Slaves came from Africa to the West Indies. The New England states provided flour, fish, meat, and lumber, and acquired tea, spices, furniture, cloth, and tools from England, and then supplied fish oil, whale oil, lumber, and tobacco back to Europe, and supplied rum to Africa in return for the slaves. So this was a very reliable circuit, a commodity circuit. So the Bank of England, for example, used government bonds as an asset and also the gold reserves of England in order to issue corporate stock and issue Bank of England notes. And so this financial revolution has been noted by many people. North and Wangast, the institutionalists, celebrate the king and parliament, who was given the power to tax, in return promised to protect property rights, including payments on the debt. And Marx, on the other hand, was quite cynical about the role of the Bank of England. He claims that the entire gold supply of the state and the credit of the state backed the bank. And he has this quote, which is, I think, amusing. Is there anything more absurd than the Bank of England, whose notes gave credit only thanks to the state, taking payment from the state, i.e. from the public, in the form of interest on government loans, for the power granted to it by the state, transform these same notes back from paper into money and then lend it back to the state. So there's something circular here, right? There's something strange going on. And so we have two different traditions interpreting the Glorious Revolution and the Financial Revolution in two different ways. But what I'd like to focus on today is the sequence of property forms and the credit relationships. And do we take these for granted and no longer inquire into where money comes from and what money backs? And so do we just not know, or do we not care? So that's the kind of question I want to ask. So the slaveholding so-called factories on the coast of Ghana in the 18th century were, let's say, an early form of property, as were the sugar plantations in the West Indies acquired by conquest, and the sugar and tobacco plantations in the southern colonies on land chartered by the crown, and then indentured servants as immigrants to North America. And then after the revolution, public lands available for sale as property to settlers, and then ultimately factories for commodity production with so-called free wage labor after the abolition of slavery. So I'm going to suggest that these forms of property then become unquestioned and provide the basis for credit circuits, which enable money to expand. So in the beginning of long distance trade, it was spices and luxury textiles from the East, gold and silver bullion from Spanish colonies, the black gold of the slave trade, and then the production at scale of commodities like sugar, cotton, tobacco, and rum, and then the textiles from the Industrial Revolution, which then undersell historic civilizations in India and China, then agricultural commodities, which are used for financial trades, and then in the modern period, petroleum. And so we have commodities that are well recognized, well traded, and these can be used for the basis of credit. And so a little bit more dramatically, Sven Beckert talks about war capitalism. And here he's not talking about the ecological forces of planetary energy balances. He's talking about force, like military force. And so these commodities and long distance trade were not original with the West, but the West took them over by specific organization. So one of these organizations was the merchant monopoly corporations backed by the state, which the state then uses to back its credit, the use of force to acquire territories, the use of force to acquire slaves, and then the use of force to compete, to defeat the competition, the wars and, the shipping conflicts among the European states. So Sven Beckert looks at the commodity circuits and mentions finance briefly, but I think finance plays a bigger role in terms of ultimately becoming the way we all live, what we need to buy commodities and houses and educate our kids and finance retirement. So money becomes a thing in itself when we no longer look at the property forms or where it came from. And so essentially money abstracts social and ecological relationships. Public finance depends on commodity circuits, which then become invisible. Merchant monopoly corporations and commodity trade provided the backing for public finance. Financial institutions like the Bank of England can then issue currency and provide liquidity for commodity and capital markets. So the nation itself is like a financial corporation, issuing debt to raise armies and expand territory and trade, betting on its own future. What matters is the completion of the financial circuit, as we know, MC and prime, not human and environmental implications. So the public debt backs the national currency. And so how many people know that today the currency, instead of being backed by gold, is backed by the nation's own debt or other nations' debt or other nations' currencies? So financial institutions are remarkably interdependent and interconnected, yet each of us thinks of money as our own individual private property and have very little sense of the social dimension or the ecological and human dimensions. So the stability of the currency depends on the growth of the national economy, compliance of the taxpayers, and the confidence of other wealth holders. Okay, so here's the double entry bookkeeping, where the tax capacity is the liability of the public, but the asset for the state. And the fiat currency is considered an asset by us, the public, and the liability of the state. And so it is circular, it's double entry bookkeeping, but we have very little awareness of this as we use currency on a daily basis. So the key financial institutions are interlocking, and this we understand from the circular flow model of the economy. And there's also a circular flow of tax and credit from public debt to the Fed issuing notes as money, to private credit, to corporations, realization of the value of the commodities by the sales price, and then paying taxes and repaying the public debt. Okay, so money, arguing, is the symbol of social relationships, symbol of the national economy as a whole, representing purchasing power, and the power of the currency depends on growth and resilience. But without recognition of the world's citizens, money would not be able to function. And the value of money is not based on its composition, whether gold or silver, but on its acceptance. So I'm wondering if I could use this analysis of money as an abstract representation, which doesn't provide us with insight into where it really comes from. So here's like 5 alternatives that are in the literature. One is to end general purpose money. And Alf Hornberg suggests we should do local money, period, or degrowth. Well, we should just stop growing. I think number 3 would get us closer by redefining property, making sure that environmental externalities are part of the legal definition of property. So Robert Goldstein has work on this, Marcia Sen and Mary Christina Wood. And so would this help reveal the forces backing public finance and restore transparency? And number 5, can we begin to use finance as a tool? So allocate global credit, not on national currencies or key currencies, but special drawing rights issued on the basis of ecological and human development indicators as a global standard. So my question, can we mobilize a constituency for fundamental reform by revealing the so-called backing of money? And that is the real backing, which is human production and ecological sustainability, which may blind us to the ecological impact that money actually puts at risk. And so if the confidence of the public is the actual backing of the currency, would the public want to know about where its power comes from? Would it want to know the origin of the power over the ecology or third world nations? I would hope so, but I guess I'm going to leave you with that question. So thank you very much. So Robin and Mitchell, would you like to go next?
Robin, you're muted.
Our plan is that I'm going to take about a minute to introduce the relevance or what it is that we're doing. So let me just go ahead and do that. The big question that we're addressing is, can we really dispense with markets altogether? In theory, but not only in theory and practice. Now, clearly there are some, very active debates. One is, well, how bad are markets? How well could they be tamed? And we've spoken to that issue. And we basically argue that what it comes down to is that we can motivate people in different ways. We can appeal to the human potentials of greed and fear. We can make people compete against one another. That's called the economics of competition and greed. And as far as we're concerned, that's what markets essentially reduce to, motivating people through those human potentials. But humans have other potentials. They have potentials for self-management. We have potentials to treat one another fairly and with some sense of solidarity. So our argument is that people can be appealed to in those ways as well. We call that the economics of equitable cooperation. So there is our argument that's the essence of our argument for why we are even interested in exploring both theoretically and practically, is it possible to replace markets altogether? Now, another thing that I want to point out is that even if we do investment planning or long-run development planning, even if we make them more democratic, more efficient, and more participatory, can we also replace market coordination with annual planning? So those two subjects can be somewhat separated. You could do planning for some purposes, but then say, oh, but we still need markets for the sort of annual coordination. And what we're suggesting is, no, we don't need them for that either. The third thing to consider is, well, is it even a theoretical possibility? Is this what early socialists actually wanted? We've addressed that in the past, and that's not what the subject of this presentation is. The subject of this presentation is, even if it's theoretically possible, and we think we've demonstrated that's the case, that doesn't mean it's a practical possibility. Would it just take too much time and energy for workers and consumers to engage in some sort of annual participatory planning process so that it's impractical? Now, until this is actually tried someplace, one cannot prove that it's practical or that it's impractical. But instead, what we have done is we have taken the next best step to test its practicality, and that is to do computer simulations of the annual participatory planning process. And we now have finished enough of that work so that we are ready to report the results to people. So just to help people keep their eye on the prize here. In our simulations, what practicality reduces to is, well, how many times would worker and consumer councils have to formulate proposals, make proposals, and then vote on one another's proposals and revise their proposals? How many times would they have to do that? That's what we call practicality. There's also a robustness issue, which is you have to make assumptions. And we basically make traditional assumptions about the natures of technologies, the natures of people's preferences. Well, in the real world, those assumptions get broken all the time. They don't hold up. So the second question, besides practicality that we're trying to address, is the procedure robust? To what degree would the procedure break down or not break down if in the real world, traditional assumptions that economists make about technologies and preferences were violated? So that's what we are reporting on, the results of these computer simulation experiments, testing the practicality and the robustness of annual participatory planning. And Mitchell, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Can everyone see my screen? I'm afraid I can't hear anyone.
So I can see a screen.
Okay, so you should see a slide that reads computer simulation experiments of participatory annual planning.
Yes.
Okay, great. On with the show. As Robin had just mentioned, the work here is with regards to a non-market, non-command planning model of economics that has come to be called, well, participatory, in a participatory economy, PE for short. In the past, this has been referred to as PARECON or as a participatory economics. Here we call it PE or participatory economy. And here more specifically, we're talking about one of the institutions within that economy, the allocation mechanism, which is referred to as participatory planning, which doesn't use markets and doesn't use command planning. The procedure in brief is that councils, decision-making bodies, propose plans and revise them with other councils in a series of iterations until all excess demand in the economy is eliminated. As Robin had mentioned, the key question with regard to this is how practical is such an arrangement? That is, how many iterations does it take for a participatory planning procedure in a participatory economy to arrive at a feasible plan? That's the focus of our research and the focus of this presentation. To speak to the specific details, the dramatis personae, that is the persons of the drama, imagine this is a play. The characters in the play in this economy are, as mentioned, councils, decision-making bodies, both for producing goods, worker councils, and for consuming goods, consumer councils. Those councils then join with other councils of various sorts. We're into federations. You have federations of worker councils and also federations of consumer councils, as well as an IFB, an iteration facilitation board, whose name, as it suggests, is to help facilitate those iterations between worker and consumer councils. The procedure is as follows. The Iteration Facilitation Board announces a set of indicative prices, our best indication of the opportunity and social costs as we can best determine it. The consumption councils make, consumer councils make consumption proposals. The worker councils make production proposals for what they think they're going to produce or consume over a given period of time, in this case, a year's time. The IFB takes all that into account and adjusts the prices based on the demands and supplies of those proposals. If everyone agrees on what everyone is going to produce or consume, and there's no excess demand remaining, we're done. But chances are that's not going to happen in the first try, so we simply repeat until there is no excess demand. The application of this in turning that procedure into computer code was originally articulated with a tool involving the programming language NetLogo, which is an agent-based programming environment for taking agents, respective councils, and having them interact with each other, in this case, in a participatory planning procedure. One articulation of this in a prototype was given the name of Participatory Planning Procedure Prototype, or PQUAD for short. That, however, had some problems, not the least of which is that it did not scale both out in terms of the number of goods that could be accommodated, nor broadly in terms of the number of councils to accommodate. So we rewrote it in a different programming language and languages. There is a computer programming language called Clojure, spelled like this with a J in the middle. That is a general purpose programming language for which we adapted PQUAD into Clojure. A related programming language that's used for web development called ClojureScript allowed us to be able to flexibly examine changes or adaptations as we needed them in the code to make sure that the adaptation was correct, and for Clojure as a general programming language to be able to do that scaling as needed. The program itself is called PQUAD CLJS, CLJS being the articulation, an abbreviation for ClojureScript, and PQUAD referring to its predecessor as a version of the PQUAD original prototype. The program was originally written in ClojureScript to work out all the programming, and then later adapted to Clojure for scaling. The algorithm matches the procedure. We first define a set of variables, including an arbitrary price factor that we then use. We generate and load a set of worker councils and a set of consumer councils as data, sets of data that are then loaded into memory. We apply a set of Cobb-Douglas functions for handling production or consumption, depending on what council you're working with. We then adjust those prices and surpluses across all categories with an adjustment rule. We did some experimentation to find an efficient price adjustment rule, and the rule that we wound up working with, and what's going to be presented here, is of the form W equals V times 1.05 minus 0.5 to the V power, where V refers to, W refers to the percentage change in the price of a good for the next iteration, and V refers to the percentage excess supply for that good in the iteration that was just completed, with a small exception that when V is greater than 0.25, we simply assign W to be 0.25. This seemed to work, but there's room for improvement. If it turns out that a better rule could be found, we could simply apply that rule into the code and see if everything is improved. Once those prices and surpluses are then adjusted, we increase our iteration counter by 1. We check if those surpluses lie within a given specified threshold. If some agreed upon threshold is met, we're done and we stop the program. But if we're not, we return to the step 3 here, where we reapply the production and consumption Cobb-Douglas functions, and we repeat. Once we're complete with this, we can then repeat the experiment, starting with the previous experiment's prices, to see if the procedure is improved. The experiments that we did for this examination involved 40 randomly generated experiments on a scaled basis, each with 30,000 worker councils, 30,000 consumer councils, 100 private consumption goods, 100 public goods, 100 intermediate goods, 100 categories of labor, and 100 natural environment inputs. Generate all of those 40 times over, load them in, check on the results. And the results in summary is as follows. To reach a 5% threshold from an arbitrary price factor took an average of 11.85 iterations. If you wanted to improve that and go to a 3% threshold, from an arbitrary price factor, so we start with an arbitrary price factor, go all the way to a 3% threshold, a threshold of a match between supply and demand among the worker and consumer councils. That took an average of 19.2 iterations across all these experiments. However, to get to a 5% threshold, when from a previous experiment's price factor, accounting for technology changes and consumer preference changes, there was improvement. It took now an average of 6.5 iterations across all experiments, and an average GDP percentage increase of 2.446%. If we muddy things up and adjust the code so that we're trying to break things by increasing the returns to scale, it turns out that the number of iterations isn't appreciably affected. The average number of iterations is 6.25, and the average GDP percentage is increased to 1.859%. The full details of all of this are forthcoming in the book that Robin had written, in which I've contributed, as well as Michael Weisdorf, who's a co-presenter of this, co-researcher with this presentation, in the forthcoming book to be published by Routledge later this year, Democratic Economic Planning. And now a demonstration where we are actually going to run the Pequant CLJS application with iterations involving 3,000 worker and consumer councils and 10 categories of each of the set goods. We reduce them from 30,000 and 100 respectively for interests of time. It would take too long to go through all of that. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to escape the demonstration code here in PowerPoint. I'm going to jump to Firefox, and we are now seeing an instance of the code running in my browser from a server running this actual code, which you can see here. And I am actually going to run the experiment as I talk about it for interests of time. We load an experiment. We set up the set of data where we have our arbitrary price factor. Here it's set to a price of 700 for each of the respective categories: private goods, intermediate goods, nature, labor, and public goods. And once the data are loaded, as well as the councils are loaded, we begin with the iterations. That is, as we've mentioned, we are loading in the data. Each of the councils are going through the production and consumption functions, the price adjustments, and you can see those going on here. So I'm going to continue on and explain what's going on here. Here are the respective prices for each of these goods. New deltas and PD lists refer to the respective changes of those prices from iteration to iteration. Supply and demand are self-explanatory. Surplus here is defined as the supply minus the demand. And you will note that the percentage surplus refers to the surplus divided by the supply represented as a percentage. Our goal is to get to 0, but depending on where you stand, you could get, depending on what you deem as an acceptable threshold, you could be done sooner than getting all the way to 0. This is color coded, and the color coding is depends on how close you are regarding all of the surpluses. Here, they are all orange, so that means that all of the surpluses are at or less than 20% for a given category. They turn yellow if they're all the surpluses are at or less than 10%. They turn green if all the surpluses are at or less than 5%. They turn blue if all the surpluses are at or less than 3%, and they're red otherwise. So as we're continuing on here, we have an iteration counter here. We can see that we've actually gone through 7 iterations, and you can see the progress here. The goal here that we would deem for the purposes of this presentation is to get to all green. So we actually have two categories after 8 iterations that have achieved green. That is, all the surpluses are at or better than 5%. Our goal here is to get to 5% across the board. We have that now after 9 iterations. We can see that we have loaded in 3,000 worker and consumer councils. We are getting very close because we can see that there are now just a handful of, in fact, here under intermediate inputs, there is just a single good that is not within the 5% threshold, which would be green. So I think one more will do it. And we are complete. So for the purposes of this presentation, we have, for this experiment, excuse me, we have achieved our threshold. We have achieved a 5% threshold across the entire economy for all worker and consumer councils in 12 iterations. So now we will actually run the repeated experiment where we will account for technological changes and other changes with the economy. There is a button here called Augmented Reset, which actually makes some changes to the data that you don't see in the presentation here, but which take place under the hood, as it were. But the one change that is noted is the iteration counter is now reset to 0. So it's now another year. We are going to present with this as our starting point, a new procedure, a new participatory planning procedure for our economy. We reiterate. And we can see that while it had turned red, that is, it was worse than 20% across all the goods, that we've already achieved some improvement after just a single iteration. We'll continue. We've got green already for intermediate inputs after just 2 iterations. Again, our goal here is to get to green for all of these iterations, that is at or greater than, excuse me, all surpluses being at or less than 5%. We're now at iteration number 3. Sometimes they can go back, but sometimes they can go forward. Here we are actually for the first time seeing blue, meaning that all the surpluses are at or better than 3%. Our goal here is 5. This is now iteration 5. Oh, we are very close. We just have a single good there that is at or greater than 5%. Once more, hopefully that will do it. Not quite. We actually have one more that is not quite there. We'll run it one more time. And we're done. This is blue, but this is better than 5%. In fact, it's all better than 3%. So we can deem this successful and done in 7 iterations. So what took 12 iterations in our previous experiment for this experiment with the new, with bringing across the price vector now is complete in just 7 iterations, a considerable improvement. To conclude, our source code is online. You can download it from GitHub at a repository here where you can download the closure and closure script code for running the experiments. The experiments that we use in this are online, are also, excuse me, the experiments we use for this research are also available online, downloading here as gzipped files to download and expand and load into the code and run yourself. The website, the repository on GitHub has instructions for how to do that. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you. I will stop the share.
Thank you very much. These are very interesting experiments. My goodness.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to hear about Morishima. So please go ahead, Jan.
Okay. Okay, I'm Zhao Yihan, a PhD candidate of Tsinghua University, and the topic of our paper is Morishima's optimum values, a more penrose pseudo-inverse approach. And it was cooperated by my tutor, Professor Li, Dr. Liang of UMass, and me. The outline of my talk as follows. In the first part, I'd like to introduce the background, the purpose, and conclusions of this paper. And the second part gives the formal definitions of the actual and optimum value. And then I'll briefly introduce the proof of the equivalence of these two values. Finally, a concluding remark is given. Well, let's move on to the first part. The motivation of this work. One of the controversies about the theory of labor value is that under the framework of joint production, labor value is not necessarily positive or unique. In fact, many works have discussed the conditions of labor value to be non-negative, but the problem of uniqueness have not been well solved. And what we want to do is to use the concept of optimum value proposed by Marishma to solve this problem. Although the concept of optimum value is proposed initially to only use to demonstrate the positiveness and uniqueness of the exploration rate. Since it is the solution of the linear programming problem, it is not an equilibrium outcome and has no additivity. Generally, it is regarded as a normative concept, but not the actual labor value. Even Malishima himself also believes that the optimum value is generally inconsistent with the actual value. So what we have done in this paper, in one sentence, we bridge the gap between the actual value and the optimum value, and by proving that the two concepts are positive, unique, and equivalent under the Max-Raffa joint production framework, and the actual value based on the Moore Penrose pseudo-inverse is one of the optimum values in a more general case. Using these results, we demonstrated that the optimum value coincides with the actual value in the economic meaning and solve the uniqueness of actual value. Before proof, we first give the strict definition and assumptions of the true values. Some matrix symbols are used to represent the input and output relationship. Here, matrix A and B respectively denotes the input and output coefficient matrix. L denotes the given labor vector, and D is the net output matrix with a rank of R. The actual value system can be described in equation 1, and the vector W gives the actual value. Now we give two essential assumptions. The first one, assumption 1, means that we only concern with the precises actually used, because the potential precise does not affect the actual labor value. And assumption 2 guarantees that the equation 1 must have at least one solution. Any other restrictions on the numbers of commodities or precises are unnecessary. When D is a rectangular matrix, the conventional inverse matrix is not defined, and the solution of equation 1 may be non-unique. And we focus on a particular solution based on the Moore-Penrose pseudo-inverse. The definition of the MP pseudo-inverse is given in equation 3. Here we use D plus to distinguish it from the generalized inverse matrix. And MP pseudo-inverse has many good mathematical properties. Using these properties, we can prove the lemma 1, which means that LD plus is one possible solution of the actual value. And now let's review the Malaysia's optimum value. The initial problem is to minimize the labor input for given net output Y, and the dual problem is to maximize the value of Y at the shadow price W. And the shadow price W is called optimum value. Next, we want to prove the relationship between the optimum value, and the NP solution LD+. Here we use the Max-Straffa framework to show the proof details. On the one hand, it helps us to show the details clearly. On the other hand, we can get more special conclusions under this framework. Okisho and Nakatani proposed this framework formally. They extended Straffa's treatment of fixed capital as joint product to Maxence models, and the assumptions 3 gives the conditions of this framework. Formally, we use matrix notation to represent this framework. Suppose there are m counts of brand new fixed capitals with the durability of D1 to Dm and n counts of consumption goods. Circulating capitals are regarded as fixed capital with a durability of 1. Thus, the total amount of commodities n equals lowercase n plus the sum of di. We use M and B to represent the input and output metrics, in which MJ and BJ correspond to the production process of brand new commodity J. KIJ and LJ represent the amount of commodity I and the labor needed to produce 1 unit of commodity J. And the structure of MJ and BJ is shown in equation 6 and 7. Where delta ij is 1 if I equals j, else delta ij is 0. For the sake of convenience, we explain the assumptions and lemma in advance. Under the Max-Straffa framework, assumption 4 is equivalent to the productive conditions of fixed capital, and assumption 5 determined by the structure of matrix B and M. It guarantees the actual value equation has and only has 1 equilibrium solution. And lemma 2 guarantees the solution of linear programming problem 5 to be unique. For the last point, mathematical proof can be shown in the reference 8. And the preparation work has been done. Now we briefly introduce the proof process. Through a series of simplification, we can get a simplified version of problem 5, where the coefficient matrix C is a square matrix and the height on the vectors represent that these vectors only involve brand new commodities. And that means the linear programming problem 8 only limits the brand new commodities. From the assumption 4 and the definition of AIJ, the coefficient matrix C is non-singular. Thus, the equation W hat C equals to L height has an equilibrium solution W hat star. Meanwhile, from the geometric point of view, the W hat star is also the optimum solution for problem 8. We have already known that there is only 1 actual value and only 1 optimum value. Using the simplified optimization problem, we can prove the theorem 1. That is, under the Max-Straffa framework, the actual value is equivalent to the optimum value. The particularity of Max-Straffa framework is that both actual value and optimum value are unique. And now we relax the restriction. Let's replace assumptions 3, 4, and 5 with assumption 6. We only need the consumption goods can be produced as a singular product. For the linear programming problem, it's easy to verify that the NP solution LD+ is a feasible solution for the constraints. What we need to prove now is that the NP solution cannot be further optimized. Since the optimization goal Y is non-negative vector, and only the elements corresponding to consumption goods are strictly positive, it is sufficient that the direction corresponding to the consumption goods cannot be further optimized. By analogy with the case under the Max-Raffer framework, we can get theorem 2, that is, under the assumption 6, the NP solution must be one of the optimum values. Now let's come to the last part, the concluding remarks. The main conclusions of this paper can be summarized into 2 theorems. The first is the actual value is equivalent to Marishma's optimum value under the Max-Raffer framework. And the second, NP solution actual value is also the optimum value as long as all consumption goods can be produced separately. These 2 theorems bridge the gap between the actual and optimum value. In this way, Marishma's optimum value is not just a normative concept, but can be realized in actual capitalist production and can have additivity. What's more important, among many possible actual values in the framework of joint production, we have identified the one with the minimum labor input, that is the NP solution actual value. From the perspective of socially necessary labor type, the actual value can be uniquely defined, and the joint production does not pose a real difficulty to the Marxian labor theory of value. And these are the references used in this paper. Thank you for listening. And because I have not posted our paper on the website, if you are interested about the proof details, you can send me an email. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, a fascinating paper. So there are some questions in the Q&A, and I wonder if we should go in order with Jacob. I don't know, Jacob, if you've had a chance to look at the questions that you have received. And if you would like to speak directly.
Yes, I have answered them in writing. Should I read them out or?
Yes, so why don't you read them out, and then there might be other people who want to join in that question.
Okay, so going back to the questions addressed to me. Robert McKee asked, how can you have local banks and utilities delivering your objectives while huge multinational behemoth banks and fossil fuel companies are not socialized? And I said that it is true there's a tension between multinational firms and local ones, which is perhaps why the latter ones tend to flourish in countries that have stronger commitments to labor in the first place, like Germany and Japan. So it does, context does matter. Next, Mariana Hill emphasized the strong links between the economic and the political need. And she pointed out that the local does not necessarily mean democratic. Totalitarians don't necessarily support sustainability. In fact, quite the opposite is likely to dominate. My response was very true. As always, context matters. So this, basically my paper is not silver bullet. It's more theory of how we could approach the problem. But you're right, it's not, we cannot abstract from the local context. Then Jenica Kramer took issue with the dualist conceptualization of humans as being separate from nature. And she thinks that this equilibria or domination of humans over nature stems from this ideology. And I clarified that, yes, I agree that people are part of nature, but my argument relates purely to institutions, political or economic. And while people are indeed part of nature, nature does not have institutions or agency by itself. Just to clarify, Jenica also disagreed with my statement that the sustainability movement acts to preserve nature over society. And indeed, I have used a generalization, but my point was if you only care about sustainability versus if you only care about humans. So it was a straw man, if you will. I think I've responded to all my questions. Yes, I think I have. unless there's new ones.
Okay, so Robert McKee had two questions for me. Why do I say the liberal state? Isn't it really the capitalist state? And I want to define a liberal state based on the rights of individuals and the protection of property by the state, which began, I argue, before capitalism became well established and may have provided the foundation for capitalism. So if you look at the liberal state, it's individual rights and individual private property protected by the state, and capitalism is a very dynamic system based on classes. And so I wanted to trace the evolution, perhaps to give more insight into where the institutions came from and to provide more transparency into the actual force behind them. So Robin and Mitchell, you have some comments also.
You know, some of those I've answered already. There's one, well, one question which I had answered, but which I'm referring to the book that Robin had, but maybe Robin may want to take a moment now. Marianne Hill writes, much of demand depends on the unexpected, on the part of consumers, disease, fire, flooding, or among reasons demand would change. I can see that a participatory economic planning could be desirable for some goods, for example, steel, etc. Plus new technologies would change demand. Would not a mix of market and planning make more sense? So I was referring to the forthcoming book that Robin wrote and which I contributed to, Democratic Economic Planning, which details the case why a participatory economy can handle unexpected circumstances. Robin, maybe you might want to take a minute or two to outline how that, more details.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's two separable questions. One is, let me put it this way. We can engage in long-term development planning of different kinds. We can also engage in investment planning of different kinds. That we can have, so we can develop all those plans. Those plans can be developed in more democratic ways, in more participatory ways, in more efficient ways, or less so. But that still leaves the question of, in the context of whatever kind of planning you've done, long-term planning and investment planning, can you actually coordinate a plan for what everybody's going to do this year? Can you come up with an annual plan? And what we've demonstrated is, well, you certainly can come up with an annual plan. We've proved theoretically you could come up with one using the procedure we've suggested. And what the simulations suggest is that it wouldn't be that impractical. Now, what is it you have when you have that annual plan? You have a plan that says, if everybody went ahead and did what they just said they are willing and able to do, that it would all be possible to do. Now, of course, on January 1st, things are going to change. People are going to change their minds. People are going to discover that there's going to be weather conditions that are different. So there's always the question of, when you start the year with an annual plan, are you going to be able to make adjustments during the year that are sensible adjustments? And the simulation experiments do not address that. That's a separate question that we've addressed in the new book, and we've talked a considerable amount about it. Starting with an annual plan that everybody agreed to, when things change, how could you go about making sensible adjustments? Is that sort of an impossible problem? And we've argued that's not an impossible problem. And as a matter of fact, badly planned economies, Soviet economies, obviously made adjustments during the year when things didn't turn out the way We're not suggesting that you do it the way they did it, but we're suggesting that, and we've outlined how would you go about making the adjustments. But the question we've addressed with the simulations is, would it just take too much time for worker and consumer councils, too much time and energy to go through this participatory planning procedure that we're proposing? And what we've discovered so far from the simulations is, well, is 5 or 6 iterations, a terribly burdensome thing? And the answer, clearly it's not. So if 5 or 6, and the tricky part was, if you start from an arbitrary starting point, from an arbitrary initial price vector, well, then it might take 15 or maybe 19 iterations. But of course, in a real world setting, you would never start from an arbitrary price vector. You would always have last year's final indicative prices from last year's plan to start from. And if you then start from them and you introduced reasonable sort of estimates of how much would technologies and preferences change, which is what we're doing when we hit the reset button. We're basically changing production functions, we're changing preferences, more or less along the lines of what we know happens in economies from year to year. And when you do that, when you start with last year's prices and you then go through our procedure, it's looking like it takes 5 or 6 iterations, which is clearly not the kind of impractical problem that many people have suggested in response to our proposal. People have said, everything you're saying sounds great on paper, and theoretically you can say you'll get to a great plan that way, and it has a lot of attractive features to it, but it's just going to take too much time and energy. And the simulations were an attempt to address, is there any reason to believe that it would just be so impractical that nobody would ever want to do it? And so far, we're actually astounded at how practical it seems to be.
So I would like to call on Andres, if he's still there, to unmute, because you had a question for both Ihan and Mitchell, and I thought it might be useful for you to ask directly, if you would like.
Yeah, for Mitchell, I was wondering, how do you guys measure the quantity of capital in your simulation exercise?
The quantity of capital, meaning capital goods you're talking about?
Yeah, in the production function, in the Cobb-Douglas production function that, as I understand, you used in your simulation exercise.
Mitchell, I know what he's asking. Let me answer it.
Okay.
That's not a value of capital in the production function. Those are actual quantities of machines. So when we say there's capital in our production function, we mean that there's so many units of a certain kind of machine. It's not a value of all the machines that we somehow have to have machine prices and do an aggregation thing. So the whole Cambridge controversy thing is irrelevant to what we're doing, because we're not trying to measure an overall value of capital. That's not what's in our production functions.
But
I know in a standard production function, you have something called capital and then you have something called labor. What we have is many different kinds of labor, how many hours of each kind, particular intermediate goods quantities, and particular kinds of capital goods themselves. That's what's in our production functions.
And so another question you raised was about the temporal dimension. So is linear programming occurring all at once simultaneously versus Hanel and Mitchell's work, which seems to be time-based? So Johan, could you address that in terms of the time dimension of the linear programming? In other words, does it all happen at one moment, or is there a chance for iteration or reaching equilibrium?
Are you asking Yihan or are you asking?
Yes, yes. So I was asking Yihan because
yeah.
I guess I will answer the questions. That has been asked, and I don't forgot. I'm not followed up your questions, so.
Okay, so Andres had asked, as I understand it, the difference between the linear programming solution, which is simultaneous, and Mitchell and Robin's work, where they're able to deal with time, like 1 year to the next, and make adjustments.
Yes. The optimization problem, I guess it is used just like 1 year or one period of production to describe the production process. It's not decided in just a moment, but in a period of one production.
Okay, so Douglas Reynolds has another question. Do you want to speak directly?
Yeah, I guess I'm okay. Doug Reynolds, University of Alaska Fairbanks. The question was, in the iterations of planning, let's say you want to use cleaner energy, but right now we use oil energy for mining purposes, but you might need metals for batteries. So if you do a planning and you try and use less oil, but then you have to plan on using more more expensive mining techniques that are electric driven, much heavier capital or much more labor intensive. But you can't easily know how much that's going to change. So as you're planning on this new cleaner energy for mining to get these metals for batteries, and you're trying to use less oil, you may have a lot of trouble figuring out how much extra capital and labor that's going to all require. How would you take account of that, I guess?
There's the work, the simulation that results that we're reporting on have nothing to do with long-term environmental planning. Well, I mean, but of course, we're proposing that you have to do long-term environmental planning. But at the start of a year, we know what inputs from the natural environment we actually have available. Just like we know how many hours of chemical engineering labor we have available, how many hours of ditch digging labor we have available. So at the start of the year, this presentation was aimed at, can you solve the problem of, once you know at the beginning of a year how much inputs from the natural environment, how much stocks of different kind of capital, how much different kinds of labor supplies are available, can you go through a participatory efficient planning process about how to use what's available right now starting this year that's practical? And that's different from the question of, well, wait a minute, how are you going to sensibly plan over time how to use environmental inputs, protect and preserve environmental inputs, and take all that into account? And that's what we call long-term environmental planning. And there's a whole chapter in the new book suggesting how that should be done. So we're not saying that you don't have to solve those problems, but at the start of any year, you already are starting with hopefully what is the optimal supplies over an extended 50, 100-year time period of different inputs from the natural environment.
So Jacob, why don't you jump in? Because it seems to me we might have a question about prices. Do you have to price the machine? Do you have to price the natural environment resources? But Jacob, why don't you go ahead?
It's related to that. You mentioned that you don't use prices for capital, just physical. So it seems like it's a non-monetary economy. And I was going to ask whether you have wages. How are wages determined? Because in a way, wages determine what people can choose to buy. I mean, they can express the willingness to buy something, but they can really afford it. And then I have a question for Anne, but I could ask that later.
Okay, when I said that we don't, in our production functions, we have the physical quantity of a certain kind of machine that you need to have on hand to be able to produce something during an annual time period. So that's the context in which the capital controversy is irrelevant. We don't have aggregate capital, a value of aggregate capital in our production functions. On the other hand, one part of our proposal is that workers are going to be paid according to their efforts as they determine amongst themselves inside their own worker councils. So there is an income constraint on what consumers can consume, So workers go to their worker council and among themselves, they give each other effort ratings, which basically determines their income. Then in their neighborhood consumption councils, when they're asking for, when they're asking for, permission to consume certain things, that becomes their income constraint. So consumers have income constraints. In our proposal, it's based on their fellow workers' estimates of any differences in sacrifices or efforts they've made in the workplace. And we suggest leave that up to workers in their workplace. That determines people's income, along with all sorts of there's other sources of income that, children have to have income. They don't go to workers. People are retired. So you have to have other sources of income as well as the income from work. But once you've settled all that, then that determines what it is that's the basis of income that neighborhood consumption councils can ask for during the planning process.
Thank you.
So then do the final goods have prices too? Because
yes, the price. So what we call these things are indicative prices. And that raises a hornet's nest of controversy, I can assure you. What we mean by indicative prices is we use the word indicative to suggest we know they're not going to be 100% accurate. We're not silly enough to think that we can get perfect prices for everything. So that's the sense in which we've always called them indicative. But what they actually are they are our best estimates of what the opportunity cost is of using some category of scarce labor, some category of a scarce input from the environment, the opportunity cost of using a machine, and we only have so many of that machine at the start of a particular year. So we have opportunity costs for environmental inputs, labor inputs, and machine stocks of different kinds of machines. And then we have the social costs of producing intermediate goods and final goods. In the planning procedure, we basically have proved in theory, as the planning procedure reaches a feasible plan, at the same time, we are generating estimates of what we're generating accurate estimates of what the opportunity costs of using things are and the social costs of producing things. That the feasible plan tells you this is what we end up doing, but the final indicative prices are, in theory, estimates of the opportunity and social costs in the economy that year. And we just refer to those things as the indicative prices because it's the Iteration Facilitation Board that is adjusting those during the planning procedure.
And so in that sense, I'm wondering if you could use linear programming in the opportunity cost or the shadow price that comes out of optimization of linear programs.
What we're calling those indicative prices are what, if you did a linear programming, if you do a linear programming solution to an economy, then the shadow price, the shadow prices you get in that linear programming solution are the same as what we're calling the indicative prices that emerge from our participatory planning process. And that part we've proved theoretically in the past. The simulations really have nothing to do with that. They have to do with the practicality.
Okay, so so Jacob, did you want to have another question?
Yes.
About, go ahead.
I had a few questions for you, Anne. I found it very interesting, your presentation on money as blinders, and I had several related comments, questions. You mentioned that governments use monies as the sinews of power to fund wars. I've been thinking about money in a different way. It used to be that only sovereigns can issue money, and more recently, private banks can issue money. So in a way, you can think of the privatization of sovereignty. But then it leads to the question of what are financial institutions? You had a table where you had public versus private and then state. Where does finance fit? And you also said that the state in some cases behaves like a financial institution. Would it be possible to think of banks as sort of unelected governments because they have some sovereign states, such as the creation of money? And then it translates to the policy arena. You had a list of 5 different policy options. I would like to add another one for my presentation, a generalized form of money, but not issued for profit. So private, nonprofit. Thank you.
Okay, so it's very important to figure out what money is, I think, again, generally because it represents a collective, but people think of it as individual private property. It's my money. And I think this gets to the other papers as well. So in fact, money is like a language. It wouldn't work if people didn't recognize it. And the central government authorizes money and provides the backing, whether it's property rights or exchange ratios with other currencies. So I think we treat money as individual private property, but it's more like a collective language that we use to interface with people and with people who are buying and selling. So it's a social dimension, but it's also how we sell and acquire property. But the property is defined again by the state and enforced by the state. So it seems to me the whole finance system is social, and the links between individuals are based on prices of what I can sell and what I could buy, but essentially the markets and those prices are then managed by the state. And so I think it's essentially a collective system that we don't see as collective. And that's why I think it's misleading, right? Because it seems to be, it's mine, but it's not really. It would have no value if it weren't for all of us. In terms of producing and selling commodities and recognizing, the money we receive when we go to buy things. And so I think the state is the invisible manager. And when we say that banks issue money, well, okay, they issue money, but the whole thing is managed by the central bank and by the international exchange rates. So I think banks issue tokens, but the ultimate value of those tokens depends on the authority of the state and the recognition of the implicit recognition of that by the citizens who are essentially holding and using the money. So I have a question for you, though. I think some questions from the audience had to do with the separation of nature versus human culture. And I've been struggling with this myself. Do we interface with nature in any other way other than institutions? And again, this is a question for you too, Robin and Mitchell. It's possible we interface with nature directly when we breathe and when we drink water, and that we just don't focus on those interactions with nature. And in fact, they're multiple and they're complex and they're interdependent. And I think we could, if we didn't use money, I think we could look at all the environmental flows that each of us is part of every moment that we're alive, and that money kind of substitutes our own social human system for what is very immediately an ecological system that we could directly, we could directly measure, like CO2 parts per million, or rain in a particular area, or groundwater in a particular area. And I don't, going back to the United Nations and the metrics that they use there, I'd like to hear more about that. But can we convert to an entirely ecological system without the interface of the human institutions? Like, can we throw away money and then simply use other metrics for our interactions with each other and with the natural environment? I don't know, do you see point of view?
Yeah, you're touching on something that came up in the Q&A, and that was my reason that I gave for taking this sort of polarized view of political versus economic, because we do interact with nature individually, of course, and indigenous communities especially have a very strong connection. I was looking at more from the problem-solving point of view. If you want to stop climate change, neither you nor I nor anyone on this call can individually do that, and then you need institutions. In terms of measurement, that's fascinating. I started my career as a statistician, and my PhD thesis was about the financialization of GDP. And I think there is a distorting element from finance, both in GDP and in other ways. And there's more research I've done and others have done that show that financialization itself is accelerating climate change, because in a way it creates more distance between people and the actual world and nature. Nature is becoming just one more asset to securitize. So I definitely think we have a lot of work to do, both in terms of conceptualizing nature. But the problem is nature cannot fight for itself. It doesn't have agency. So in my presentation, I was hoping the political could represent nature, because the economic so far has failed to do that. But there's plenty of work to do.
But then again, there is work to put prices on nature within the market. And so would that help us with our interactions? I mean, so Robin, you're still using an opportunity cost. And so why not use market prices to reflect opportunity cost? I mean, do you have a reason for wanting to go beyond markets?
Right. I think any sort of sensible decision, any sort of sensible economic decision making needs to know what are the opportunity costs of using different things. What does it really cost society to produce different things? I think there's a whole host of reasons that in market economies, market prices systematically misestimate what the true opportunity and social costs are. And these are well-known things that we know. Any of us who are environmental economists sort of know all sorts of reasons. One thing that, I want to be sure that this is sort of like truth in advertising. In our proposal for how it is that the annual planning should be done, we have what's called a demand revealing mechanism for externalities and public goods. The public goods are in the simulations, but the externalities aren't. We haven't finished that work yet. So there's work to be done. And I just wanted to mention that. So we know that we still need to put the externalities in and see to what extent we have a proposal for how they are accounted for, but we did not simulate that aspect of reality. And the other thing I wanted to say was that we were astounded by the results in two ways. We were very, very surprised at how few iterations it seems to take, because 30,000 councils, basically when you figure how many people in a council, we're already simulating an economy that's 3 times bigger than Cuba, that's 3 times bigger than Austria. That's essentially the same size as Venezuela or Thailand. So in terms of sort of how many people do we have in our worker councils and our consumer councils? We've got a lot of them. We certainly already got, you know, many, many different kinds of goods of all kinds. And yet still it seems that it just wouldn't take that much time for the people to do what they have to do to engage in this very participatory planning process where people have a tremendous amount of control. No, every workers' council, they're the only ones who ever make a proposal of what they're going to do. Nobody else tells them, oh, well, now we figured out that you should be doing such and such. So there's a tremendous amount of autonomy over one's own activities that consumers and workers have in this proposal. And it seems to be a lot more practical than we even thought it was. The one area in which we're still very surprised by results and need to do a lot more exploring is, so far we introduced, we violated the decreasing returns to scale assumption. And we violated it very strongly, and the system didn't break down, which quite frankly is a surprise. I mean, so there's a lot more work to be done in the area of let's violate traditional assumptions about technologies and preferences and see whether or not the planning process remains sufficiently robust even when those violations occur. Because quite frankly, I am shocked that we have yet to be able to break the plan. We have yet to be able to violate traditional assumptions and fail to be able to reach a feasible plan in a fairly reasonable number of iterations. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done in that area. And I do want to thank, I was remiss. We got funding, we've gotten a tremendous amount of support from the Systems Science program at Portland State University and the director of that program, Wayne Wakeland. That program, two of the students that worked on all this were in that PhD program, and that program has been very, very helpful in seminars that we've presented at in getting this work done. And we got funding support from the Institute for Solidarity Economics, headed up by Colm Macy in Oxford, England. And that helped us get started. So I did want to acknowledge that we had gotten all that institutional support from those two wonderful institutions.
So Robert McKee, I was wondering if you could unmute yourself because you've had several comments about the papers also.
Good afternoon, Anne. Can
Sorry?
you hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, well, I've done my questions, I think, and everybody's replied accordingly. I don't know what you want me to add.
I just wasn't sure what you meant about chartalism.
Yeah, well, I got the impression, Anne, that your approach was that basically you said that there's a combination between the state, as it were, bringing money into the process of circulation in an economy, and that rather than money coming out of the process of the development and the of commodities and the generalization of commodity exchange across economies, which I think, in my view, would be Marx's understanding of historically how money came about to become a generalized form, and that capitalism captured the state. The capitalist mode of production for commodities, the production of commodities through the exploitation of labor, captured the state. Of course, the state was there before and money was there before, but in a modern capitalist economy, what we've got is the state operating in the interests on the whole of the capitalist mode of production and production of commodities through the exploitation of labor. There is the alternative view, which is that actually money is a product of the state, the need for the state's funding and to tax people, and therefore it produces or develops, prints as a sovereign state money in order to provide that to the population so that it can tax it back. That's the chartalist approach. And I felt that perhaps the direction you were going on was in that direction. Perfectly okay if that's what you want to do, but it's certainly not one, I think, that meets the history of money in a modern capitalist economy?
So I think it's an excellent question. And maybe I could say all of the above, because let's say the chartalists came first because the state was able to coin money as one of its original functions. But I see the state today as managing capital-labor relations and managing the property rights by which labor is exploited, right? So that firms couldn't hire workers to work longer to produce more value than their labor time of their wages without the support of the state, which manages the capital-labor relations and the world trade relations, but then acquires part of the surplus for its own reproduction. So it's almost, see if you think this is a reasonable approach, that the capitalist state helps support the exploitation of labor, so to speak, at the workplace. And then part of that surplus goes to the reproduction of the state, which is then used to make public goods to help support the market and the extension of the market. So right now, getting back to money, money is able to extract surplus from world trade, which then helps firms and ends up part of repaying the taxes to the state. So I see it as very complementary. I don't think capitalism could work as well without the state. And I think the state wouldn't be able to issue credit without acquiring surplus from capitalist production. So what do you think?
Well, I agree with that more or less, I think. I don't find, I find that more of a clarification. I thought the implication of the presentation that you made was actually you were saying something much more significant than that in the history of the development of money and capitalism. That your phrase, I think, was that, I forget the exact phrase, but money, we don't know where money comes from. Money has become, the cause or source of money has become hidden from us because of this process of circulation between the state, the banks, and other financial institutions. In that sense, I would say that money's always been hidden from ordinary people, working people who do not understand, on the whole, that actually money is a product of their own exploitation of themselves through the capitalist mode of production. That's the point I think that Marx wanted to bring home to people. It reminds me of the Robert Tressel's book, Ragged Trousers of Philanthropists, where he makes it clear what the money trick is, and that's how that money ends up in the hands of capitalism, the capitalist, in whatever form it takes, joint stock or individual. And from that, as you say correctly, I agree with you entirely, that the state then plays the role of protecting and developing the capitalist mode of production through whatever measures, both by war and by public taxation and by spending. And so that's the way in which the money process goes on. So if money is not hidden, suddenly hidden, it's some special thing that we have to notice that money is, the source of money is hidden. No, the source of money has always been hidden in that sense. And there's nothing particularly new to say, it would seem to me, that we've got something different now in this new modern 21st century finance capital world that was different, say, 150 years ago when Marx wrote the book. That's the key point for me. What is different that makes money more hidden, or hidden now when it wasn't 150 years ago?
Okay, so I think, again, that's an excellent question. And so let me try to answer it. Right now, the finance system seems, so let's say after 2008, the logic was, oh, we have to bail out finance first because it's the heart of the economy. We can't do without finance. And I think that whole thing totally misrepresents the reality, so to speak. And so if it were more clear that, it's the working population that supports money, not the reverse, would that make it easier to also make visible the environmental degradation? And so that's the question, can we go back to some sort of transparency of money? And I think Marx was helpful in that respect. And it's almost like we need to do new Marx to help explain financialization. But you mentioned, Robert Tressel, and maybe you think that work already makes it clear.
And could I make a comment about Yihan's paper just briefly?
Sure.
Yihan, I just wanted to tell you that when you present a mathematical paper, it doesn't lend to the same kind of discussion that other papers do. On the other hand, I thought your paper was very, very valuable. And because I think what if I understand it correctly, I think what you have managed to demonstrate is that I think of it as a SRAFA sort of price system, but it's considerably more robust to sort of complications such as joint production than people had believed previously. That what you've basically demonstrated is that system, which I think is a very useful system, is not confined to a set of assumptions that are as narrow as has been traditionally believed. So I just wanted to say that I think it's a very valuable contribution.
Okay, so I'm sorry, go ahead.
Thank you for your comments. As far as I'm concerned, the Marx-SRAFA framework is just a tool that we can use it to show the proof details. But actually, we don't need so strict assumptions to prove our the main point. Just only the assumption 6 that all consumptions goods can be produced separately. It is the main assumption for our theorem 2. And what I want to talk about is the Marx-SRAFA framework. It may be controversy that the SRAFA's framework of the production process is controversial to the Marx value system. But of course, the Marx-SRAFA framework its base is the value system of Marx, and we only use the method to deal with the fixed capital as a joint production byproduct, and I think it's not controversial to the Marx value system.
Okay, so Michael Weisdorf has, I think, one comment, and that would be our last one. Michael, would you like to address us all?
Sure. Hi, I'm a PhD candidate at Portland State University and a co-author with Mitchell and Robin. When I read these abstracts, I thought, wow, this is a really interesting collection of papers that maybe aren't very closely related, but after hearing the presentations and following this discussion, I think maybe there's more common ground than I originally thought. I just wanted to comment that money is understood to have multiple functions in the capitalist market economies that we're familiar with, but we can dispense with some of those functions in the participatory economy that our work is intended to explore. The aspect in which we still use something money-like is that we still have a unit of social opportunity cost that is in which the indicative prices are denominated. So in that sense, there's still there's a money-like unit, but there's no need for market exchange. There's no buying and selling. There's no need for prices in the marketplace to complete these plans. And certainly there's no need for bank accounts with monetary savings.
Is that just labor hours? That's what you mean, really, isn't it?
I mean, it could be, but it's not required that you resolve it out to the Marxian labor theory value necessarily, right? They're relative. We're going to get interrupted here, I think, by the clock.
Yes, so thank you all very much for excellent questions and excellent presentations. I wish we had a week because it seems to me that these issues are very rich, and I hope we have a chance to continue this work. So thank you very much.
Thank you for moderating.
Thank you.
Hope to see you again.